Coming to you from sunny South Carolina, it's the Palmetto Conservative Show with your host, Jim Lee. From the upstate to the low country, from the coast to Columbia, we'll cover what's right and uncover what's wrong in the Palmetto State. If we see it, we say it. We call it like it is in South Carolina. And now, it's the Palmetto Conservative Show. Let's jam.
Welcome into a Thanksgiving edition of the Palmetto Conservative Show here on the Conservative Broadcast Media Network. I'm your host, Jim Lee, part political junkie, part technology geek, part commentator, and often snarky agitator for the application of common sense and the pursuit of critical thinking in the marketplace of ideas, particularly as it relates to the Palmetto State. I don't profess to have all the answers, folks, just an awful lot of relevant questions. Here we are, it's as you're listening to this, the day before Thanksgiving. We'll leave it up to you, at least right now, to determine whether you think you have a lot to be thankful for. I think we do, and we'll talk a little bit about that tonight here on the Palmetto Conservative Show. Usual and customary disclaimer here on the show. I'm not here simply to give speeches, to display rancor, vituperation, or engender bitterness. I'm not here to throw around incendiary language or to try and incite violence, but rather I am here trying to inflame your senses, such that we will do something that we desperately need more of in our marketplace of ideas, in our political discourse, and that's a little bit of critical thinking. Too little of that going on these days, as we see over and over in the events of the day. Glad you're with us here tonight, enjoying the opportunity here to once again take on the cacistocracy. For those of you who might be new to the Palmetto Conservative Show, no, I usually am not so challenged as to speak, but getting underway here. We talk about the cacistocracy quite a bit. For those who aren't quite clear with the definition, the cacistocracy is the government by the worst persons, or a form of government in which the worst persons are in power. And I can think of no better word to describe what we have today, at least at the federal level. If you're in a different state other than South Carolina, your mileage may vary, and you may be tickled to death with your form of government and the persons in power. I, for one, can say with no reservation that on balance, very dissatisfied with Washington, and believe that we do have more of the worst persons and too few of the right persons. You know, Plato once said that one of the penalties for refusing to participate in politics is that you end up being governed by your inferiors. And that, I fear, is certainly what we have. So here, railing against the cacistocracy once more. Now, got a pretty sweeping program here planned for tonight. Can't promise you we'll stick directly to the schedule, but if we do, it's going to be chock full of nuts. If we don't, then well, it'll still be chock full of nuts. I just have no idea what format and schedule they will follow. But here we go. We start off this week on a somewhat sad note. Sad for a variety of reasons. First of all, we want to express our condolences to those like myself who are facing the thought of a future without a Twinkie. Now, I know it sounds somewhat childish, perhaps, to talk about that, but understand, the Twinkie holds a special place in my heart and in my past. You see, the very first job that I ever had was as a morning newspaper delivery boy, or delivery person. It wasn't politically correct back then, but delivery person, whatever. And every morning, I would get up well before the crack of dawn, This was back when people actually read newspapers and had them delivered to their home. But anyway, and the only time that I would see any of my customers in the daylight was when I was coming around to collect. But I digress. Every morning I would wake well before dawn, prepare the newspapers for delivery by rolling them, putting them in baggies if necessary, rolling them up in such a way as to make it easier to toss them or to insert them in mailboxes or wherever it was they were to be placed. Because back in that day, if you were worth your weight in newspapers, and if your goal was to try and get the biggest tip possible, because you got a mere fraction of a penny for every paper delivered, you wanted to make your money on tips, you would make sure that the paper was placed wherever it was that the customer wanted it, whether it was between the outer and the inner door, whether it was in the hook underneath the mailbox, underneath the mat on the porch, or wherever. But anyway, getting up before the crack of dawn, preparing the newspapers, walking the route, delivering the newspapers, coming back home, and sitting down at the kitchen table with a nice tall glass of cold milk and a frozen Twinkie. That was how I rewarded myself. Granted, I'm sure that Michelle Obama would frown upon such a choice for breakfast foods, but be that as it may, I'm here many, many years later, and no worse for the wear. No worse for the wear for having worked a job like that either as a young teen. But nevertheless, now we find that the Twinkie is soon to be no more. And it really is a shame because it isn't a result of all of a sudden a complete loss of the markets. It's not a loss in demand that people no longer want them. It's not because of anything criminal, that there was something defective with the product. There wasn't a huge bacterial problem in manufacturing or an E. coli breakout, much as you see some companies who were in meat processing that had these sorts of things that killed the company. No, this was, as the Wall Street Journal so aptly put it, nothing short of a suicide. I'll give you a little background on this, but this taken from an article in the Wall Street Journal, I believe it was last Friday. Perhaps it says something about America, though we're not quite sure what, that iconic junk foods like Twinkies, Devil Dogs, Ho-Ho Snacks Cakes, and Wonder Bread have endured since the 1930s, despite changing consumer health and eating habits. It does say something about institutions that can't, or refuse, to adapt to new economic times, that the company behind those products has chosen to go out of business overnight. Hostess's owners have decided to liquidate rather than ride out a nationwide strike by one of the largest of its dozen unions, the Bakery, Confectionery, Tobacco Workers, and Grain Millers International Union. Now, if I could go off on a slight rant here, one company manufactures one line of products. They're all baked goods. It's not like they manufacture train parts, tires, and bakery products. It's all one thing. But there are no less than a dozen unions involved. And because of the cost of maintaining the benefits and salary programs for these unions, they've decided that it makes more sense to liquidate rather than to try and ride out a nationwide strike. And we'll get to the details on that in just a second. The Texas-based company, owned by the private equity shop Ripplewood Holdings and other hedge funds, essentially gave up. On Friday, November 16th, it shut down its 33 bakeries and 565 distribution centers and prepared to fire nearly 18,500 employees en masse and auction off its brand and recipe portfolio. Now think about that for a second. Not just 18,500 people, but 33 separate bakeries, production facilities, 33 communities that will be impacted by probably one of their larger employers shuttering its doors, and 565 distribution centers. Again, 565 communities impacted by this. Not to mention about the millions who will be impacted by the inability to get their hands on a Twinkie. Hostess posted sales of $2.5 billion in 2011, but lost $341 million and lacked the cash flow to hold out through the Bakers Union's work stoppage that had only lost a few days of production so far. One reason is a labor rule burden that, by comparison, makes Detroit look like Hong Kong. The snack giant endured $52 million in workers' compensation claims in 2011, according to its bankruptcy filing this past January. Hostess's 372 collective bargaining agreements required the company to maintain 80 different health and benefit plans, 40 pension plans, and mandated a $31 million increase in wages and health care and other benefits for 2012. Think about that for a second. 372 collective bargaining agreements. This is one company, folks. 18,500 people. Got to do the math real quick on that, but seems to me like it's an awfully large number. Looking at this real quickly. That's one collective bargaining agreement for every 50 people. Just on a bureaucracy level, that's unsustainable. But we digress. Union work rules usually required cake and bread products. Mind you, cake and bread products, not cake and chemical products, not cake and tire products, not cake and train parts, but cake and bread products to be delivered to a single retail location using 2 separate trucks. Drivers weren't allowed to load their own vehicles, and workers who loaded bread weren't allowed to load the cake. On most delivery routes, another pull-up employee moved products from back rooms to shelves. Now, if you'll allow me, let me go back to where I started with this story, my very first job. This would be akin to having the newspaper company to deliver the newspapers to my house, but not to my front porch, only to the front curb, and someone else being employed to move those papers from the curb to my porch, where someone else would prepare the newspapers for delivery. Someone else would pack the papers into a pouch to be carried by the actual delivery person. And there would be a separate organization to handle collections and payments. It's insane. Union work rules required all of these things. On most delivery routes, another pull-up employee moved products from back rooms to shelves. This year, management negotiated concessions from some of the unions, including the Teamsters. But the bakers rejected a last and best offer in September. Then the courts gave Hostess unilateral authority to modify collective bargaining contracts, prompting the strike. So, now it will liquidate, instead of attempting to emerge from Chapter 11 intact. The 18,500 layoffs are equal to about 11% of the net new jobs the entire U.S. economy created in October. The unions are blaming private equity or Bain Capital or capitalism, but the election is over. And so is Hostess.